I woke up in a hospital bed with morphine in my bloodstream, and the specific disorientation that comes from a surgery nobody tells you the full details about beforehand. The fluorescent lights were doing something expensive to my vision. My left shoulder was wrapped in enough gauze to qualify as a mummy costume. And standing at the window with her back to me, looking out at a city I did not recognize in a posture that suggested she had been there for hours, was Iris Reeves. Before we continue, if you want to hear the uncensored, too hot for YouTube versions of stories like this, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you're watching from and subscribe. Now let's get into how I ended up here. The last time I had seen Iris was 3 months ago in the rain. She was wearing the same blue coat she had worn for 2 years, and I was holding out the diamond ring I had promised to wear for the rest of my life. And the rain was doing something to both of our faces that neither of us was going to recover from cleanly. I had not planned to hand her the ring that day. I had planned to wait until I had figured out how to say it out loud. How to tell her that getting married to her would mean being complicit in a lie. And I had spent enough of my life being complicit in things, and I was running out of years to stop. She had caught me at the train station, not accidentally. She had waited for me to come out, had stepped into my path with that quiet certainty that was specific to Iris, and had asked me directly what I was doing, leaving our apartment at 7 in the morning with a packed bag and a credit card in my pocket but not my phone. I could not lie to Iris. I had never been able to lie to Iris. That was part of the problem. So I had stood there in the rain and told her the truth, which was that I was not in love with her anymore. Which was the cruelest thing I could have said because it was not accurate, but it was close enough to accurate to hurt, and she had absorbed it the way she absorbed everything without flinching, without asking me to soften it, just taking the weight of it and standing inside it. I had handed her the ring because holding it felt obscene after that. She had looked at the ring for a long time. Then she had closed my hand back around it and walked away. And now she was standing at the window of a hospital room where I was waking up from anesthesia, and I did not know how to begin to account for that. My mouth was too dry to call out. My throat felt like it had been surgically altered, which in fact it had rotator cuff repair. The pre-op nurse had explained cheerfully, as if that was a casual thing, as if she had not just described a procedure that involved cutting into my shoulder joint and reconstructing something that had apparently decided to disintegrate. Iris turned. She moved immediately, the way trained nurses do, with the economy of someone who has read 10,000 patient charts and knows how to translate morphine fog into specific needs. She was in dark scrubs and a white lab coat with her name embroidered in precise lettering. Iris Reeves, RN. Her hair was pinned back. She looked exactly the way she looked when she was not thinking about me, which was like a knife in the ribs. She said, "You're awake." 1 through 10, I said. My voice sounded like I had swallowed gravel. She moved to the IV stand and checked something. Her hands were steady. I had watched those hands build a life with me for 2 years. I had watched them hold a coffee cup on Sunday mornings. I had watched them shake, exactly once, the morning I told her I was leaving. She said, "I'm going to adjust your medication. You're at about 4 hours post-op. The shoulder is going to be uncomfortable. That's normal." I said, "Iris." She did not stop moving. She updated the chart with the focused attention she brought to everything that was not me. I said, "What are you doing here?" She hung fresh saline, checked the monitors, became fully occupied with the work in front of her. I said, "You're not my nurse." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I was on the recovery roster. I requested your room assignment." The morphine was making everything feel soft around the edges, but this statement, this cut through it like a blade. She had requested my room, specifically, after I had handed her a ring in the rain and told her I was not in love with her anymore. I said, "Why would you do that?" She looked at me finally. In the fluorescent light, with the hospital around us and the professional frame she was holding like a shield, she looked like the woman who had spent 2 years learning every specific thing about how I needed to be cared for. She said, "Because you didn't have family in the intake forms, because you were coming in alone, because the surgeon's notes indicate you're going to need mobility support for 8 weeks, and I know what that looks like for someone like you. Someone like me. Someone who kept her distance. Someone who did not ask for help easily. Someone who had been pushing people away so consistently that by the time she realized she was doing it, the distance had become the only language she knew how to speak. She said, "You don't have to have me care for you. I'll speak to the charge nurse. But you came in with nothing, no contact information, no emergency number that isn't your ex-fiancé, no support structure visible. So I'm offering 8 weeks, recovery, that's all." I said, "Why would you want to do that after what I did?" Her expression did not change. She was very good at not letting her expression change. She said, "Because you're a person who needs care, and you're a person I can provide it to. The first part has nothing to do with what you did. The second part I'm choosing despite what you did. Does that make sense?" It did not make sense. It made devastating sense. It made the kind of sense that only happens when someone who has every reason to walk away decides to stay anyway, and does it so quietly you barely notice you've been saved. I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "I know you are. Take your medication. Try to sleep. I'll check on you at 2. She left the room. I lay there in the hospital bed with the morphine working and my shoulder rebuilt and the specific knowledge that Iris had just offered me something I did not deserve, and I had no framework for how to receive it. The first week was the worst because the pain was not the real problem. The pain was manageable, chemical, a thing that responded to medication and ice and the specific positioning that Iris taught me. The real problem was the intimacy of recovery. It was Iris helping me into the shower because I could not raise my left arm above shoulder height. It was her adjusting the water temperature with her hands while I stood there in the privacy of a hospital bathroom trying not to think about the fact that she had seen every part of me and had decided, after 3 months of rain and endings, to wash my back like it was a simple thing. It was her bringing me coffee at 5:30 in the morning, set on the table to the right of the bed so I could reach it without moving my shoulder. It was her sitting in the chair across from me during her breaks, checking my wound site with the clinical attention it required, and somehow making the clinical attention into something else. It was her voice saying my name, not professionally, just in the hallway outside the room when she thought I was asleep, like she was reminding herself I was still there. On the second day, my mother called the hospital. A nurse transferred her to my room and Iris stood at the edge of the room, giving me privacy while still being present. My mother's voice was thin over the phone, worried in the way mothers are when their children refuse to let them help. I said, "It's fine, Mom. Recovery is going well." She said, "Who's staying with you?" I could not tell her the truth. That Iris, the woman I had destroyed, the woman whose ring I had handed back, was the one making sure my pain medication was timed correctly, the one who knew how to move my shoulder without causing additional damage. I said, "The hospital has everything covered. Good nurses." Iris made a noise in the background. Not laughing. Not quite. The sound someone makes when they are absorbing the weight of a lie they have decided not to correct. My mother said, "You're alone." I said, "I'm fine." She said, "No, you're not. You sound alone." After we hung up, Iris came back to the bed and adjusted my pillows without being asked. She said, "Your mother sounds worried." I said, "She has reason to be." Iris was quiet for a moment. She said, "Do you want me to call her? Tell her you're being monitored?" I said, "You don't have to do that." She said, "I'm offering because it's practical, not because I'm being noble. Your mother is going to spend the next week calling every hospital in the area trying to figure out how you're managing alone. It's easier if someone tells her the truth." So Iris called my mother. I listened to her explain my recovery timeline in the professional voice she used with physicians, clear, clinical, precise. And then I listened to something shift in her tone. Not unprofessional, just human. She was telling my mother that I was going to be fine because she was going to make sure of it. My mother asked to speak to me after. She said, "That's the woman you left." I said, "Yes." My mother said, "Why is she there?" I said, "I don't know yet." My mother was quiet for a long moment. She said, "Don't lose her twice. Once because you were running. Don't lose her again because you're too proud to ask her to stay." On the 9th day, I was cleared for limited weight bearing, and Iris brought me the discharge paperwork. She said, "You have physical therapy starting Thursday. The surgeon wants you twice a week for the first 4 weeks. You'll need rides." I said, "I'll call someone." She did not look up from the paperwork. She said, "You could stay with me. My guest room has everything you need. You could be closer to the PT clinic. It would be practical." I stared at her. She was offering me shelter. She was offering me proximity. She was offering me the thing I had destroyed 3 months ago, and she was doing it so calmly that it took me a moment to understand what she was actually saying. I said, "Iris." She looked up. Her eyes were very clear. She said, "I'm not offering you forgiveness. I'm offering you recovery. There's a difference. The first one is something you earn. The second one is something you accept." I said, "I can't stay with you." She said, "Okay." That was all. Okay. Like it was that simple. Like she had not just saved me a week of logistics and pain and the hollow feeling of trying to recover alone. She helped me gather my things. She walked me to the car I had called, and she stood on the hospital steps in the late afternoon light and watched me drive away, and I felt every single one of the 3 months between the rain and this moment. I went to physical therapy at a clinic that was 12 miles from my apartment. I did the exercises that hurt and did not help. I sat in waiting rooms with people who had rotator cuff surgeries that went better than mine had, and I told myself I was fine, I was managing, I did not need anything from anyone. On the 4th day of PT, my therapist said, "You're not engaging with the mobility work. You're going through it. That's different." I said, "I'm here." She said, "You're present. You're not here. There's a difference." It was the same distinction Iris had made. Presence versus engagement. Going through it versus actually doing it. That night I texted Iris. I said, "How is the guest room situation?" She responded immediately. She said, "Available, whenever you're ready." I showed up on a Thursday evening with an overnight bag that I had packed, assuming I would stay 3 nights, and then go back to my apartment and pretend I was recovering fine alone. I stayed for 8 weeks. The guest room had its own bathroom. Iris had stocked it with everything before I arrived: soft towels, the expensive shampoo I liked, a reading light that did not hurt to look at. She had created a version of recovery that was designed specifically for the person she remembered me being, which was a person who needed beauty alongside function. There was also a small vase on the nightstand with a single stem of white orchid. No note, no explanation. Just the flower that she knew I liked, placed where I would see it first thing in the morning and last thing at night. The first week I barely left the room except for physical therapy. I did my exercises with the discipline I brought to everything, which meant I did them badly because discipline without desperation is just going through motions. Iris would appear at the open door around 7 with dinner, never elaborate. Always something I could eat with one hand. Always set on the table where I could reach it. She did not sit with me while I ate. She would set the food down, ensure I had water, and leave me to it. The respect in that the refusal to make my recovery about her presence was its own form of devastation. By the 2nd week my shoulder was ready for more range of motion work. By the 3rd week I was moving through her house without thinking, which meant I was moving through her life without thinking, which meant I was relearning the specific geography of her apartment like I had never left. The kitchen where she made coffee at 5:30. The living room where she read at night with a single lamp and a book that was always something demanding. The hallway where photographs of her family hung with the care of someone who came from people who had stayed, who had shown up, who did not walk away in the rain. The guest room where I slept, acutely aware that her bedroom was across the hallway, that she was close enough to hear if I called, that she was choosing not to cross that distance even though the crossing would have been easy. By week 3, I found a journal in the guest room nightstand. It was hers. The handwriting was unmistakable, precise, controlled, the same handwriting that appeared on medical charts and personal notes. I should not have read it. I did anyway. The entries dated back 2 years. They started before she had proposed to me. They were clinical at first observations about my habits, my preferences, the way I moved through the world. And then they became something else. They became the interior monologue of someone watching the person she loved build a life with her while being terrified that the life was not real, that the feeling was not shared, that one day I would walk away. The last entry was dated the day before I handed her the ring in the rain. She had written, "I think she's leaving. I can feel it in the way she's been distant. I've been holding so carefully, thinking if I was perfect enough, If I was careful enough, it wouldn't matter. But I think I've lost her already. Maybe I never had her at all. I put the journal back. I did not tell her I had read it. But that night I understood what she had been carrying. Not just the fact of my leaving, but the specific knowledge that she had seen it coming and had been unable to stop it. Week 4 arrived with a cold snap. I was moving better, was able to manage more of my own care, but the weather made the apartment feel smaller and more intimate. Iris came home from her shift with her hands numb from the cold, and I made her tea without being asked. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around the mug and looked at me like she was trying to read something written on my face. She said, "You found my journal." I did not ask how she knew. I said, "Yes." She set the mug down slowly. She said, "I thought you might. I left it where you would find it." I said, "Why would you do that?" She said, "Because I needed you to understand what you did to me. Not in an accusatory way. Just I needed you to know that the version of me that came to your hospital room was not noble. It was desperate. It was a woman who had already lost you once and was terrified of losing you again without at least trying." I said, "You should have hidden it better." She said, "No, I should have told you all of it to your face. I'm telling you now." She said, "I have been in love with you for 2 years and 3 months. I watched you fall not quite in love with me. I watched you try to fit yourself into a shape that was supposed to be forever. And I knew it was not going to work, because I know you better than you know yourself, and the you that I know does not do forever without being completely present. And you were not present." I sat down across from her. She said, "When you handed me that ring in the rain, I felt relief. Which was the most awful thing about it. I was relieved that you were finally being honest, even though the honesty was that you did not love me. At least it was the truth." I said, "I did love you." She said, "You loved the version of me that made your life easier. You loved the convenience. You loved the structure I provided. That's not love, that's logistics." I said, "That's not fair." She said, "It's not about fair, it's about true. And the true thing is that you were running before you even knew you were leaving." By week 6, something had shifted in the way she looked at me. She was no longer holding me at the distance of caretaker. She was looking at me like someone who had decided the truth was less dangerous than the lie. She said, "I want to show you something." She took me to her office, the small room at the end of her apartment that I had never entered. It was organized in a way that was entirely her. Books on medical ethics and fiction mixed together without apology. Plants on the windowsill that were overgrown and healthy, the specific chaos of someone who knew what mattered and did not waste energy on the rest. On the wall was a photograph I had forgotten existed. Both of us, 2 years ago, at a concert. I was laughing at something she had said. She was looking at me, instead of at the stage. It was the photograph of someone completely undone. She said, "This is why I came to your hospital room. Not because you needed me. Because I could not live in a world where you might need someone else." By week 8, I had moved out of the guest room without announcement. It happened gradually, a shirt left in the closet, a book placed on her nightstand, my toothbrush moving to the same drawer as hers. By the time either of us said anything about it, I had already stopped going to the guest room. We did not have the conversation all at once. We had it in pieces, the way you have conversations when you are learning to speak to someone you have already hurt, which means you have to earn back the right to certain words. She said, "I need to tell you something about the last 3 months." We were on the couch again, evening light coming through her windows, her apartment the kind of quiet that only happens when 2 people are sharing silence without filling it. She said, "I did not request your hospital room assignment for noble reasons. I did it because I could not stand the thought of you being in pain around strangers. I could not stand that you had listed no emergency contact. I could not stand that you had burned down everything we had built, and I was still the person most invested in, whether you survived it." I said, "Iris." She said, "Let me finish. I need to be honest about all of it. Not the version where I was graceful about it. The version where I was angry and sad and furious with you for throwing away something real, And I was still willing to come to your hospital room and wash your back, because that anger and sadness and fury does not change what I feel. It just changes what I do with it. The room contracted. This was the version of her that I had feared seeing, not the composed nurse, not the careful friend, but the woman who was allowed to be complicated. I said, "I know you were angry." She said, "You do not know. You left. You did not watch what you did to other people. You did not watch me pretend I was fine at work while I was destroying myself at home. You did not watch your mother call me, asking if I had heard from you. You did not have to be the person who explained to your people that you had decided I was not enough." I looked at her. I had not thought about what the ending had looked like from her side. I had been so occupied with being the person who was leaving that I had not accounted for being the person who was left. I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "I know you are. And I'm sorry for the version of me that came to your hospital room expecting to be noble about it. I was not noble. I was desperate. I was trying to solve my own breaking by fixing yours. That's not noble. That's self-preservation dressed up in care." I said, "It worked though, the care." She said, "Yes, and that does not make it okay that my motivation was partly selfish." I said, "Everything is partly selfish. People are partly selfish. You did a thing that cost you something and you did it anyway. That's the only version of good that actually exists." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I have been in love with you for 2 years. Before the proposal, through the proposal, after you handed me the ring and told me you were not in love with me anymore. I am still in love with you. And I have been managing that for 3 months with zero expectation that you were going to come back. And then you texted about the guest room and I understood that you had nowhere else to be, and I took that as my opening, which was opportunistic, and I want to say that out loud. I crossed the space between us and sat directly beside her. Not touching, just closing the distance. I said, "You took it as your opening because it was your opening. And I walked through it knowing exactly what you were offering and what it was going to cost me to accept it." She said, "What was it going to cost you?" I said, "The version of myself that could keep running. The version that could tell myself I was fine alone. The version that could hold on to the lie that I was not in love with you anymore and believe it was true." She looked at me. I said, "I was in love with you when I handed you the ring. I was in love with you when I walked away. I am in love with you now. And somewhere in the last 16 weeks I stopped trying to talk myself out of it and started trying to figure out what to do with it." She did not move. I could see her holding herself very still, the way people hold themselves still when they are afraid that moving will break something. I said, "I think I want to have the different conversation now." She said, "Tell me what that conversation is." I said, "I want to know if you are still willing. Not out of rescue, not out of fixing me, out of actually wanting me to be here, in your space, in your life, knowing exactly what I did and choosing anyway." She turned to face me. On her couch, in her apartment, in the space she had made for me when I did not deserve it, she said, "I am choosing anyway. I have been choosing anyway since you woke up in that hospital bed and looked at me like I was the most devastating thing you had ever seen." I said, "What happens now?" She said, "Now we figure out what this is, without the proposal, without the forever structure, without me needing to be the one saving you, or you needing to be the one being saved. Just us, attempting to build something from the wreckage of what we broke." I said, "I don't know if I can do that." She said, "Okay." I said, "I don't know if I can promise you forever, because I have already promised you forever, and broken it. I don't know if I can promise you certainty, because I have already proven I can change my mind. I don't know what I can promise you except that I am here, right now, and I would like to see what happens if I stay." She reached out and touched my face. Her hand was warm and specific and exactly where it needed to be. She said, "That is exactly what I am asking for." Over the next few weeks, something settled. It was not the settling of resolved conflict, it was the settling of two people who had been broken in very different ways, deciding that being broken together was somehow better than being broken apart. Iris went to work. I worked from the apartment. We had dinner together most nights. On the weekends, we walked through the neighborhood and she showed me the places she liked, a coffee shop where they knew her order, a bookstore where she spent too much money on medical journals and fiction, a park where she went when she needed to think. I was relearning her, not as the woman I was going to marry, not as the woman who had saved me, but as the woman who existed when no one was watching, the woman who swore at the news, the woman who cried at the end of a particular book, the woman who left her socks on the bathroom floor and claimed it was because she forgot them there, not because she was lazy. The woman who loved me in the particular, specific way that only happens when someone knows exactly what they are choosing and chooses it anyway. Week 13 brought Iris's family to visit. Her mother, a woman with Iris's same precise movements and careful eyes, stood in the living room and looked between us with the specific clarity of someone who could read situations like medical charts. Iris's mother said, "So you came back?" I said, "Yes." She said, "And you're staying?" I said, "I'm trying to." Iris's mother nodded once, a gesture that acknowledged both the attempt and the difficulty. She said, "That's better than the first time. This version will hold better because you both know what you're risking." Iris's father hugged me. He did not ask questions. He just held me in a way that suggested he understood that some people return to places they once destroyed, and that returning was its own kind of courage. By week 20, I went back to the physical therapy clinic for my final clearance. The therapist cleared me for full activity. My shoulder was rebuilt. I was, according to every medical metric, recovered. Iris came to the appointment with me. She sat in the waiting room while I did the final evaluation, and when the therapist cleared me, she was the first person I looked for. We drove home in silence. At her apartment, I said, "I'm recovered." She said, "Yes, the shoulder is healed." I said, "Which means I can go back to my place. I can drive. I can live independently again." She said, "You can." I said, "Do you want me to?" She pulled into the parking space and turned off the engine. She looked at me in the afternoon light coming through the windshield. She said, "I want you to do what you need to do. I have not spent 5 months learning to live with you so that I can make you feel obligated to stay out of gratitude or responsibility or fear of leaving again." I said, "What if staying is what I need to do?" She said, "Then I would like that very much." I said, "I know that. I'm asking if you're sure." She said, "I'm not sure about anything, but I'm willing to find out if you are." That night, we crossed a line we had been circling since the breakfast table. It started in the kitchen. She was making dinner, and I was setting the table, and her hand touched mine while we were both reaching for the same glass. She did not pull away. I did not pull away. For a moment, we both stood very still, aware of the contact in the way you are aware of a door opening into a space you have been standing outside of. She said, "We should talk about this before it happens." I said, "Okay, talk." She said, "I need to know if you are doing this because you feel obligated or because you actually want to." I said, "I want to. I have wanted to for weeks. I have been waiting for you to want to." She said, "I have wanted to since you woke up in that hospital bed. I have been waiting for you to be ready." I said, "I'm ready." She set down the knife she had been holding. She turned to face me fully. Her expression was not composed, it was open in a way I had seen it be only once before, when she was telling me the truth about her journal, about her years of loving me, about everything she had been holding. She said, "This will be different than it was before. This will not be the version where I was performing a role. This will not be the version where you were running. This will be the version where we are both actually here, both choosing, both present." I said, "I understand." She reached out and touched my jaw. Her hand was steady. Everything about her was steady. She said, "I love you, not as someone you used to be in love with, as someone you are in love with right now. That is what I need you to know." I said, "I love you too. I think I never stopped." She kissed me. It was not dramatic. It was not desperate. It was the kind of kiss that only happens between two people who have been broken in very specific ways and have decided that breaking together was the point. Patient. Earned. A question finally answered after months of circling. She pulled back and looked at me. She said, "Bedroom or couch?" I said, "Bedroom." We moved through her apartment with the ease of two people who had learned the geography of shared space. By the time we reached the bedroom, my hands were shaking, and she had noticed, and was treating it with the particular care she brought to everything fragile. She said, "We can stop anytime." I said, "I don't want to stop." What happened next was not dramatic. It was slow. It was the kind of intimacy that only happens when you know someone completely, and decide to show them every part of yourself anyway. It was her hands learning the scars from surgery, tracing them like they were something to be honored rather than hidden. It was my hands learning the geography of her in the darkness, finding the places that made her breath catch, understanding that the breath catching was permission to continue. It was the two of us, taking time with each other in a way that had nothing to do with urgency and everything to do with presence, with attention, with the particular intensity that only comes from knowing that this person has already seen you at your worst and has chosen to stay anyway. It was her whispering my name, not like a question, just like she was confirming I was real. It was me understanding, in the darkness, that love was not the thing I had run from. Love was the thing I had been running toward my whole life, and I had finally stopped running long enough to let it catch me. Afterward, we lay in the darkness with her head on my chest and my hand in her hair, and I understood what recovery actually meant. It was not the absence of damage. It was the presence of someone willing to sit inside the damage with you and help you build something new from it. She said, "What are you thinking?" I said, "That I should have stayed. After the hospital, after the first time you offered, I should have stayed immediately instead of making you wait." She said, "I'm glad you didn't. If you had stayed immediately, it would have been out of obligation. Now you're here because you chose to be, that matters." I said, "I was running from you." She said, "I know." I said, "I'm done running." She lifted her head and looked at me in the darkness. She said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yes, I'm sure. I have been running my whole life from things that matter and people who care about me. I'm done. I'm staying. I'm staying with you. I'm staying in your apartment and your life, and I'm staying open to the possibility that we can build something real from what we have now." She kissed me again. It was not the same kiss as before. It was softer. It was the kiss of someone who had just been given something they had been hoping for, but had learned not to expect. By month 2 after that night, I had stopped thinking of it as temporary. My things were not in the guest room anymore. They were distributed throughout her space, my books on her shelves, my clothes in her closet, my coffee mug in the cabinet beside hers. We had built a life with the kind of ease that only happens when both people are actually present. We developed routines. Saturday mornings we went to the farmer's market and picked out vegetables we would cook together. Wednesday evenings we had dinner with Iris's family. Sunday afternoons we sat on her porch and read in silence, which was its own kind of conversation. Iris's family met me for the first time since the breakup at a dinner in their home. Her mother held me for a long time without saying anything. When she pulled back, she looked at my face, and then at Iris's face, and something in her expression shifted. She said, "You two are different now." Iris said, "We are." Her mother said, "Good, this is better. The other version was always going to break. This version has already broken and has decided to stay anyway. That's stronger." We did not get engaged again. We did not set a wedding date or make plans for a future that existed in some abstract version of forever. What we did was show up for each other every day in the specific, complicated, very real way that only happens when you have already walked away and have chosen to come back. My mother called one Sunday afternoon while we were reading on the porch. I answered and told her I had company. She asked if it was Iris. I said yes. She said, "Put her on." I handed the phone to Iris, who took it with the slight surprise of someone being handed something significant. I listened to my mother thank her. Thank her for staying. Thank her for not letting me disappear completely. Thank her for believing in the version of me that I could not believe in myself. Iris said, "I'm not doing anything special. I'm just loving her." My mother said something I could not hear. Iris's eyes got very bright. After we hung up, Iris said, "Your mother told me that love is not about perfection. It's about persistence. About choosing someone on Tuesday morning when things are ordinary, not just on the first day when things are exciting. I said, "My mother is smarter than she looks." She said, "She looks pretty smart." By month 6, we had stopped counting months and had started counting years. My career had restructured in a way that meant I could work from anywhere. Iris's hospital had offered her a leadership position that would take her away from bedside nursing, but would use her precision and her care in a different way. We talked about what we wanted, not forever, just next, the next year, the next 5 years, the trajectory of a life we were building together, without the pressure of it being perfect. 9 months after I woke up in that hospital bed, I was doing a video call with a client when Iris came home early from her shift. She set a coffee on the table beside my laptop, my order, made exactly the way I liked it. I wrapped up the call and looked at her. I said, "You're home early." She said, "I traded shifts. I wanted to spend the afternoon with you." I said, "This is something that happens now. You just showing up and asking for the afternoon." She said, "Yes. Is that okay?" I said, "It's more than okay." She sat on the couch beside my desk and we talked about nothing in particular the day, the news, the way her brother was doing in his marriage, which had apparently gotten better now that he had stopped pretending it was something it was not. That evening, we cooked dinner together. She handled the pasta, I handled the sauce. We had developed a specific rhythm in the kitchen, the kind of coordination that comes from doing the same thing every day for months. While we were eating, she said, "I have been thinking about something." I said, "What?" She said, "A future. A real one. Not the version where we are waiting for the other shoe to drop. A real one where we build something that lasts." I set down my fork. She said, "I am not asking you to marry me. I'm asking if you would be willing to think about a life that is intentional about us, not the version where you're recovering. The version where you're choosing." I said, "I'm already choosing, every day." She said, "I know. I want to make it official, not with a ring, with whatever you need to feel like this is permanent." I looked at her across the table, the woman who had washed my back in the hospital, the woman who had offered me shelter when I did not deserve it, the woman who had loved me through the breaking and had stayed for the rebuilding. I said, "I want to build a life with you, a real one. The version where we are not waiting for it to end, the version where we are actively making it mean something." She said, "Then that's what we'll do." We did not get married. We bought a plant together and named it something ridiculous. We got a second key made and put it on a chain she wore around her neck beneath her scrubs. We told her family that we were permanent. We told my family that I had found the person I was supposed to find. We built the kind of life that does not require a ceremony to be real. The kind that is made real by every morning you choose it, every dinner you cook together, every conversation where you tell the truth instead of the comfortable version. 1 year after I woke up in that hospital bed, we were sitting on her couch, the same couch where she had held me when I was terrified, where we had circled the truth before saying it out loud. She was reading. I was reading. The television was off. The apartment was quiet in that way it only is when two people are comfortable being silent together. She said, "I have a confession." I looked up. She said, "When I requested your hospital room assignment, I knew exactly what I was doing. I was not being noble. I was being opportunistic. I saw a door opening and I walked through it." I said, "I know." She said, "You know?" I said, "Of course I know. I have always known. I just needed you to admit it so we could stop pretending that this was something other than what it was." She closed her book. She said, "What was it?" I said, "It was me waking up to the sight of the person I had destroyed everything with, standing at the window of my hospital room. It was you choosing to care for me anyway." It was the slowest, most painful recognition that running away had been wrong, and that the person I had been running from was the only person who had ever actually seen me. She reached over and took my hand. She said, "That's what it was for me too. That moment, watching you wake up, I thought about all the time I had wasted trying to be perfect enough to keep you. And then you woke up and looked at me like I was still the only thing worth looking at, and I realized I did not have to be perfect. I just had to be present." We sat there in the quiet apartment, Our hands joined over the space of the couch, in the life we had built from the wreckage of what we broke. It was not the forever we had planned. It was better than that. It was the forever we had chosen, day by day, with full knowledge of what we had lost and what we had gained. It was not a love story about two people who never faltered. It was a love story about two people who faltered completely, who broke what they had built, and then who stood in the ruins and decided to build something better, more honest, more real. It was the story of learning that love is not about the permanence of the structure. It's about the willingness to keep showing up, day after day, to the person who has already hurt you and proven that they can hurt you, and choosing them anyway. It was the story of Iris, who waited, who loved in silence, who offered shelter when she had every right to close the door. It was the story of me, learning that home was not a place. It was the woman who made coffee at 5:30 in the morning. It was the woman who read medical journals with the same intensity she brought to fiction. It was the woman who loved me through the breaking and had faith that there was something worth building on the other side of it. It was enough. It was, actually, everything. 18 months into our rebuilding, we took a trip. Not a vacation. Iris did not think in terms of escapes from life. Just a weekend away, at a cabin she had rented, somewhere we could be alone without the apartment's specific geography, without the routines that had structured our days into predictable shapes. The drive took 4 hours. Iris drove and I navigated, a role reversal of who we had been before I left. She asked me about the roads, about the weather, about whether I wanted to stop. Small questions that added up to something larger, that I mattered now in the detailed choreography of her decisions. We arrived as the sun was setting. The cabin was small and remote, with a porch overlooking forest and a kitchen that was barely equipped for cooking. But there was a fireplace and large windows, and the kind of silence that only exists when two people are completely alone. The first evening we sat on the porch with drinks and did not talk much. Iris pointed out constellations. She had memorized them as a child, she said, spending nights on the roof of her parents' house trying to understand the structure of the universe. She said, "I thought if I could understand the stars, I could understand anything. Turns out stars are just stars. It's the people that are complicated." I said, "Are we complicated?" She said, "No. You're actually very simple. You love or you don't. You stay or you go. You chose to stay. So now we're not complicated. We're just here." On the second morning, I woke to find Iris in the kitchen making breakfast from what we had brought with us. Eggs, bread, fruit, simple things, prepared with the same precision she brought to everything. She had set a small table by the window and had placed a single flower picked from somewhere outside in a makeshift vase. I watched her from the doorway. This woman who had loved me through every version of myself, who had read my journal without permission, and had decided to trust me anyway, who had built a life with me that did not depend on wedding rings or promises of forever, just on the daily decision to wake up and choose each other again. She sensed me watching. She said, "Come, eat before it gets cold." The meal was ordinary and perfect. We talked about nothing specific. She told me about a difficult patient she had worked with, someone who had refused pain medication because they did not believe they deserved comfort. Iris had sat with the patient for 30 minutes during her break, not saying anything medical, just sitting. She said, "Sometimes people need permission to accept help. They need to know it's not weakness." I understood she was talking about me, that she had known, even before the hospital, that part of my leaving had been about not believing I deserved the kind of love she was offering. On the drive back, Iris's hand found mine. She kept it there the entire drive, even as she navigated traffic, even as the route became familiar and we moved back into the city that was our shared home. She said, "I want to tell you something." I said, "Okay." She said, "I used to think that loving you perfectly would make you stay. That if I was careful enough, present enough, attentive enough, you would recognize that I was worth staying for. And then, when you left, I thought it meant I had failed at that particular mathematics." I said, "You didn't fail." She said, "I know that now. But the reason I came to your hospital room was not because I believed I could fix it. It was because I had learned that love is not something that needs to be deserved. It's something that exists independent of whether it's returned. I loved you not because I thought it would change you. I loved you because loving you was the truest thing I knew how to do. By year 2, we had settled into a rhythm so complete that we stopped thinking of it as something we were building. It simply was. Morning coffee with the newspaper. Iris's shifts and my work schedule organizing naturally around each other. Dinners with her family. Calls with my mother. But there were also the hard days. Days when I was still processing what I had done, the damage I had caused. Days when Iris was exhausted from work and did not have the emotional resources to be the one managing my guilt. One evening I said, "I don't know how you forgave me." She set down her book. She said, "I didn't forgive you. I just decided that the hurt was not more important than the love. Those are different things." I said, "I want to do something. Something that makes it clear to you that this is not gratitude. This is not obligation." She said, "You already are. Every day. Every time you choose to stay, to engage, to be present, that's what matters." But I wanted more. I wanted some external marker of what this had become. A week later, I took Iris to the same spot where I had handed her the ring 3 years before. The train station. The rain was not falling this time. It was clear and cold, the kind of weather that makes everything sharp and visible. I said, "I know I asked you to marry me before, and I broke that promise, and I know we decided not to do marriage this time, but I want to make a different kind of promise." I took out a necklace I had commissioned, a simple chain with 2 keys joined together, a key to her apartment, a key to the car we were now sharing. Practical keys, not symbolic ones. Keys to the actual structure of our actual life. I said, "I promise to stay. Not forever, because I know I can't promise that and mean it. But today, and tomorrow, and the tomorrow after that. I promise to keep choosing this. Keep choosing you. Keep choosing us, as long as you're willing to have me." She took the necklace and held it for a long moment without putting it on. She said, "Do you know what you're promising?" I said, "Yes. I'm promising to stop running." She put on the necklace. The keys rested against her heart, beneath her shirt where only I would see them. She said, "I accept." And that was the ceremony. Not in a church or a garden or any place designed for promises. At a train station where everything had nearly ended. Where everything had actually ended. So that everything else could begin. 3 years after I woke up in that hospital bed, we bought an apartment together. Not rented. Bought. With a down payment we had saved together, arguing about the color of the walls, the size of the kitchen, whether we needed a garden. Iris wanted a garden. She said she wanted to grow things with her hands after spending so much time with machines and monitors. We got a small plot of earth, and we planted seeds. Tomatoes that grew gangly and determined. Herbs that filled the kitchen with their scent. Flowers that came back year after year because we had learned how to tend them. The apartment was ordinary, nothing that would have impressed anyone, but it was ours. The kitchen where we made breakfast together. The bedroom where we had learned each other's body and heart in equal measure. The porch where we sat on Sunday mornings and read the news and talked about the day ahead. On the anniversary of the day I woke up in the hospital, Iris made dinner from scratch. She had taken the day off. She had cleaned the apartment. She had set the table with actual candles and flowers. I said, "Is this a special occasion?" She said, "It's the day you came back to me. I think that's worth marking." We ate and talked and drank wine. And then we moved to the bedroom with the kind of ease that comes from knowing someone completely, from having been broken together and having chosen to build something new. And afterward, lying in the darkness with her hand finding mine, I understood something that I had been learning slowly over 3 years. Recovery was not about being healed. It was not about the moment when the pain stops and you can move forward like nothing happened. Recovery was about learning to live inside the damage, to build a home in the space where you had broken something beautiful, and to trust that what you built there would be strong enough to hold both of you. Iris said, "Are you happy?" I said, "Yes. Are you?" She said, "Yes. I'm happier than I thought I would be after everything. I'm happier because we had to rebuild it, because we know what it's like to not have it. We don't take it for granted." I turned to face her in the darkness. I said, "I love you. Not the version that was easy, The version that required me to grow. The version that asked everything of me and gave more back. She said, "I know, that's why I stayed." By year 4, we had settled into the kind of love that does not need to be announced because it's simply visible in the way we move around each other, the way we anticipate each other's needs, the way we sit in comfortable silence. My mother came to visit. She walked into our apartment and looked around at the evidence of our life together. Shared books, shared space, a kitchen with 2 coffee mugs hanging on hooks side by side. She said, "This is good. This is really good." She hugged Iris. She did not thank her. She had moved beyond gratitude into a simple acknowledgement that this woman was part of our family now, not because of rescue or obligation, but because she had earned her place through years of choosing to stay. Iris's mother and my mother became friends. They sat at our kitchen table and talked about their daughters, the mistakes we made, the courage it took to come back from them, the specific way that love shows up when you stop trying to perform it and start just living it. On a Tuesday morning, 5 years after I woke up in that hospital bed, Iris came into the kitchen where I was making coffee. She set a small box on the counter. She said, "I got you something." Inside was a new journal, leather-bound, new. She said, "I thought you should write down our version of the story, not for anyone else, just so you know, on days when you doubt it, that this was real. That we were real. That the breaking and the rebuilding were both real." I opened the journal to the first empty page and held the pen she handed me. She said, "Start with the hospital. Start with the day everything changed." And I did. I wrote the first sentence. I woke up in a hospital bed with morphine in my bloodstream and the specific disorientation that comes from a surgery nobody tells you the full details about beforehand. And I kept writing. I wrote our story as I lived it. Not perfectly. Not with the distance of time, but with the specificity of someone who had learned that love is not about the moment it begins. It's about the moment you choose to keep it going, day after day, even when it would be easier to walk away. Years 6 and 7 passed. We renovated the apartment. We took more trips. We built careers and friendships and routines and rhythms. We had the kinds of conversations that long-term partners have about the future, about whether we wanted more, about the shape our lives would take. Iris was offered a position at a hospital across the country, a job she had always wanted, a position that would have meant leaving. She came to me and said, "I don't want to go if you're not ready." I said, "I'm ready. I'm ready for whatever you are." We moved. A new city, a new apartment, a new chapter of the same story. On our first night in the new place, Iris stood on the balcony of our new apartment empty because we had not yet moved our things in, and she said, "Do you regret anything?" I said, "I regret the 3 months where I was trying to convince myself I did not love you. That was the only time I was wrong." She said, "I regret nothing, not even the pain, because it brought us here." By year 8, the story was so integrated into our lives that it stopped being a story about rescue or breaking or rebuilding. It became simply the narrative of 2 people who had chosen each other, who had learned that love is not a destination you arrive at and stay in permanently. It's a practice, a daily choice, a commitment that must be renewed every morning. On the night before the 8th anniversary of my surgery, Iris said, "Do you remember what you thought when you woke up and saw me at the window?" I said, "I thought you were a dream. I thought I had lost you completely and my brain was being merciful." She said, "I was thinking the opposite. I was thinking you had given me a second chance I did not expect, that you had given me permission to stay." I said, "I don't think I gave you permission." She said, "No, you didn't. I took it. That's what I want you to understand. I am here not because you deserve to be saved. I am here because I deserve to be loved. And staying was how I loved myself, as much as how I loved you." This was the thing I had learned over 8 years. That love is not about sacrifice. It's about alignment. It's about 2 people deciding that building something together matters more than any individual thing either of them could build alone. In year 9, we went back to the hospital, not because I had to, just because I wanted to. Iris took me to the recovery room where I had woken up 5 years prior. A different patient was in the bed. A different story was beginning. but the room was the same. The window overlooked the same city. The light came in the same way. Iris stood where she had stood that day and said, "I was so afraid when I saw you on that bed, not of the surgery, of the fact that I still loved you, that nothing, not the ring being handed back, not months of silence, not the specific rejection, had changed the fact that I loved you." I said, "I am grateful every day that you were afraid and stayed anyway." She said, "I didn't stay because I was grateful for anything. I stayed because I was in love. And love is the only thing I have ever trusted more than reason." We left the hospital. We drove through the city we had lived in together for 9 years. We drove past the coffee shop where we had had our first honest conversation, past the apartment we had rented together, past the park where we had learned to walk again after the breaking. And finally we drove to the train station where I had handed her the ring in the rain, where I had made a different promise years later. There was no significance to it anymore. It was just a place. But we stood there anyway, hand in hand, and we remembered what it had been, and acknowledged what it had become. Iris said, "I want to tell you something I have never said." I said, "Okay." She said, "If you had not left, I would have had to ask you to leave, because I could not build a life with someone who did not choose it completely. And you were not choosing it. You were accepting it." I said, "I know. I was running from myself, not from you." She said, "Yes. And sometimes people have to leave to learn that the thing they were running from was actually the only thing worth staying for." During year 6, Iris decided she wanted to teach. Not just practice nursing, she wanted to mentor the next generation, to pass on not just technical skills but the philosophy of care that had shaped her entire approach to medicine. She enrolled in a graduate program. It meant late nights and research papers, and the particular exhaustion that comes from learning something new while still working full-time. I watched her at the kitchen table at midnight, reading medical ethics journals, arguing with theories in the margins of papers. I said, "You're going to burn out." She said, "No, I'm coming alive. I spent so long managing other people's crises that I forgot I had my own desires. This is the part where I get to be selfish." I made her tea. I sat across from her and did my own work so she was not alone. This was what partnership had become, not needing to be entertained or engaged constantly, just the knowledge that someone was present while you did the work of becoming yourself. On the night before her final presentation, I brought her food, and she barely ate it. She was reviewing slides, practicing the delivery, testing the microphone. She said, "I'm terrified." I said, "Of what?" She said, "That I've been performing the role of the person in love for so long that I've forgotten how to just be in love. That if I'm not taking care of you, if I'm not managing the dynamic, I don't know who I am in this relationship." I said, "You're the person I choose. Every time. That's all you need to be." The next day, she gave her presentation and received recognition from her program. Afterward, standing in the auditorium, her mother on one side and me on the other, Iris cried. Not because she was happy, because she realized she had spent so many years being the one who held things together that she had forgotten how to let anyone hold her. That night, roles shifted. I held her while she processed the specific grief of reclaiming parts of herself that had been dormant, of understanding that even the most generous love can require some self-suppression, and that learning to take up space was its own act of courage. By year 7, we had developed what we called our check-in nights. Once a month, we would sit down and talk about the relationship itself. Not about life logistics, but about us. About whether we were still satisfied. About where we felt disconnected. About what we needed to rebuild or adjust. It was not always comfortable. There were nights when Iris had to tell me that she felt I was still holding something back, that there were parts of me I had not fully opened to her. Nights when I had to tell her that sometimes her need to fix things made me feel like a project rather than a partner. But we did the work. We named the patterns. We adjusted them in the behavior. We tried again the next month. One night, Iris said, "I need you to know something." I said, "Okay." She said, "There are still days when I'm angry about what you did. Not angry enough to leave, but angry enough that I need to acknowledge it exists. I've been trying to be the good partner who has completely moved past it, but the truth is, I haven't completely moved past it, and I don't think I ever will. I said, I know. She said, you know? I said, of course I know. I'm the one who caused it. The anger is justified. I'm grateful that you can feel it and stay anyway. She said, I stay because I want to, not because I've forgiven you completely. Because I've decided that the version of us that exists now is worth more than the resentment of what you did. It's a choice I make continuously, not a state I've arrived at. This became the framework we use to understand our relationship, not forgiveness as a destination, but choosing each other despite the damage, day after day, because the choosing itself becomes the repair. In year 8, Iris's parents celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. Her mother gave a speech at the party and talked about the early years when everything felt fragile and uncertain, and how they had built their marriage by learning to fight well, to apologize specifically, and to keep choosing each other even when choosing was hard. She said, marriage is not about never falling out of love. It's about never giving up once you do. It's about the commitment to fall in love again, every day. Iris squeezed my hand. I knew she was thinking about us, about how we had skipped the formal commitment, but had somehow done the deeper work of building something that would last, because we were choosing it consciously, rather than defaulting to it. That night, driving home from the party, Iris said, I want you to understand something. If we ever got married, it would not be because I was afraid of losing you. It would be because I wanted to celebrate the choosing. Because the choice is not obvious or easy or guaranteed. It would be an acknowledgement that we did the work and we're still here. I said, do you want to get married? She said, I don't know. I have to think about what marriage would mean for us, whether we need the structure or whether we've built something that transcends the need for it. We talked about it over the following months, not as something we had to decide, but as something we were genuinely exploring. Iris read books about partnership. I thought about what a marriage would look like when both parties had already proven they could leave, had already proven they could stay, despite the knowledge that they could leave. By year 9, we had decided that marriage was not essential to what we had built, but it might be a meaningful acknowledgement of the journey. The wedding would be small, no formal ceremony, just the people who had supported us through the rebuilding. We planned it for late spring. The location was not a church or a garden. It was the apartment we had bought together, the kitchen where we had learned to cook as a team, the porch where we had sat through countless mornings and reviewed our days. The night before the wedding, Iris asked, do you have any doubts? I said, no. Do you? She said, no. But I wanted to give you the opportunity to say them if you did. I said, I don't have doubts. I have gratitude. I have the specific knowledge that tomorrow might not happen, and I'm grateful it is. That's different from doubt. The wedding happened on a Saturday in May. 20 people, my mother and Iris's family, the friends who had supported us through the rebuilding, the therapist we had seen when we were first learning to communicate as a couple. We wrote our own vows. Mine was simple. I promised to keep choosing, to keep showing up, to keep learning, to keep believing that what we had built was worth the work it had required. Iris's was longer. She spoke about the specific moment of seeing me wake up in that hospital bed, about the choice she had made to risk her heart again, about the years of learning that love is both fierce and tender, both strong and fragile. She said, I choose you not because you complete me. I choose you because I am complete with you, because together we are larger than we are separately. Because the version of myself I become when I am with you is the version I want to be. We exchanged simple rings, not as symbols of ownership or permanence, but as visible reminders of the daily choice. After the ceremony, we sat at a table with my mother and Iris's mother, and they toasted us. My mother said, I never thought I would see this day, not because I doubted you, but because I thought the damage was too significant. I'm grateful I was wrong. Iris's mother raised her glass and said, to second chances, to people who love fiercely enough to come back, to the courage it takes to rebuild what you've broken. By year 10, exactly a decade after the surgery that had brought us together, and then brought us apart, and then brought us back together, we took a trip back to the hospital. Not to the recovery room, to the main entrance. We stood there, and looked at the building that had marked the beginning of our second story. Iris said, "Do you remember the moment you woke up?" I said, "Every detail. The lights, the morphine, you at the window, the specific knowledge that I had lost you completely, and that somehow you were still there." She said, "That moment changed everything for me too. Before that moment, I was just a person who loved someone who did not love her back. After that moment, I was a person who had decided to love anyway. That's when everything became possible." We went inside the hospital. Iris showed me the recovery room, which was exactly the same and completely different, because I was different and she was different, and what we had built in the years between the first waking and this moment had transformed both of us. We ran into Dr. Reeves in the hallway. She had been the surgeon who rebuilt my shoulder. She looked at us standing together, holding hands, and something in her expression softened. She said, "I remember your case. Difficult surgery. But I knew you would have good recovery support. I could see it in your partner's face." Iris said, "I requested her room assignment in recovery." Dr. Reeves smiled. She said, "I know. I approved it. Some decisions are about medicine, and some are about humanity. That one was about humanity." On the drive home from the hospital, Iris said, "I want to tell you what it was like, the morning after you left, waking up alone in that apartment." I said, "You don't have to." She said, "I want to. I think you need to understand the full weight of what I absorbed when I chose to stay." She told me about the specific loneliness of that morning, about calling my mother and not knowing what to say, about going to work and pretending nothing was wrong while internally breaking apart, about the night she found my journal and realized I had known I was going to leave weeks before I left, which meant I had lied every day in between. She said, "I was so angry. Not with you, with the world, for making loving someone such a painful act. I felt like I had been betrayed by the universe, that I had loved well and honestly and it had been wasted." I said, "It wasn't wasted." She said, "I know that now. But that night, it felt wasted." I took her hand and held it through the drive. I said, "I'm sorry for making you feel that way." She said, "I know. And I'm sorry for being angry about it for so long, but I'm also not sorry for being angry. The anger was valid. And the fact that I could feel valid anger and still choose to stay, that's what made this work." By year 11, we had stopped counting the years in terms of the surgery and had started counting them in terms of the wedding. Year 1, of marriage. Year 2, year 3. The origin point had shifted. It was no longer about the breaking. It was about the building. Iris published a book. It was about nursing ethics, about the specific moral complexities that arise when caring for another human being. In the acknowledgments, she thanked me without naming me. She wrote about a person who taught her about the difference between caring for someone and fixing someone, about the importance of allowing people to have agency in their own recovery. The book was reviewed well. She gave readings. She was invited to speak at conferences. One night, after a particularly well-attended reading, she came home exhausted and happy. She said, "I never would have written this book if I had not loved you badly in the first place." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I mean that my mistakes with you, trying to fix you, trying to be perfect enough to keep you, trying to manage the outcome, those mistakes became the thing I understand most deeply about my work. They became the foundation of everything I teach now, about caring for others without controlling them." I said, "So, something good came from the breaking?" She said, "Something good came from the whole arc. From the breaking and the staying and the rebuilding and the learning. From all of it. None of it alone would have been enough. All of it together became everything." By year 12 of marriage, year 17 of knowing each other, year 13 since the surgery, we were preparing to move again. Not because we had to, but because Iris had accepted a position directing a nursing program at a different university in a different city. A career opportunity that represented the culmination of everything she had built. The night before we left the apartment we had bought together, we walked through the empty rooms, all our things packed, all our life temporarily suspended between here and there. Iris said, "I'm nervous about the move." I said, "About starting over in a new city?" She said, "No. About whether we can rebuild what we've built here, in a new place." I said, "We will, because we'll be doing it together. And we know how to do this now. We know how to break down the walls and rebuild them stronger. She smiled. She said. On our last night in the apartment, we made love in the empty bedroom. Not with the intensity of early passion, but with the deep knowledge that only comes from years of learning each other's body and heart. With the specific tenderness that exists when two people know they have survived breaking each other and have chosen to come back. Afterward, lying on a blanket on the empty floor, our bed already packed, Iris said, "Thank you." I said, "For what?" She said, "For coming back, for staying, for choosing this even when it would have been easier not to." I said, "Thank you for requesting my hospital room assignment, for offering the guest room when I was too proud to ask, for loving me through the breaking and the rebuilding." She said, "We both did the work. That's what matters." The new apartment was larger. It had space for Iris's growing collection of books, and for my home office, and for the life we were still building. We had learned, over 17 years, that building a life together was not something you finished. It was something you did every day, in small choices and large ones, in the daily decision to show up and do the work. On the morning of our first day in the new city, Iris made coffee in a kitchen she did not yet know, and we sat on a porch overlooking a street we had never lived on before. The city was different. The apartment was different. But the fundamental thing was the same two people who had learned to love each other through damage and doubt and difficulty, still choosing each other, still building, still learning. She said, "I want to know something." I said, "What?" She said, "If you could go back to that moment at the train station when you handed me the ring and told me you were not in love with me anymore, if you could change it, would you?" I said, "No." She said, "Why not?" I said, "Because the breaking was necessary. Because we could not have built this if we had not first broken completely. Because the version of us that exists now could only exist because we had to fight for it, had to rebuild it, had to prove it was worth rebuilding." She reached over and took my hand. She said, "That's why I asked. Because I needed to know that you understood this was not a story that could have gone a different way. This was always going to be a story about breaking and coming back, about learning to love through the damage instead of despite it." I said, "It's our story." She said, "Yes, and I'm glad it's this one."